Hey everyone, this is Dr. Robinson. I hope that you all fared well in the storm. If you did not, I hope that you are getting the resources that you need and are taking care of yourself first and foremost. Of course, as I mentioned in my announcement to you guys, please let me know if you need extended time, if you need assistance in getting your assignments done. I understand that, people were affected differently in various parts of the state. And so, let us know if you need anything at all. Really, truly, there's flexibility built into our syllabus and course structure at this point because so many people were affected. So that being said, I'm going to give you a brief little overview of Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 is on assessment and diagnosis. And this is pretty critical in working in addictive use disorders or with addictive use disorders, whether they're substance use disorders or process addictions. Being able to accurately, properly screen and assess and diagnose gives you a great sort of guideline for treatment and treatment planning options. So interesting to note that of the 27 million people who we estimate affected with addictive use disorders, 8 to 9 million of those meet the criteria for both mental health and substance use disorder. I don't think that's accurate. I don't think the numbers that we have on people struggling with addictive use disorders is accurate in general because we take those from individuals who are treated. So if you haven't been treated, you may not be counted properly. There's other various factors that might affect these numbers, but what you do need to know is that in addition to being diagnosed with an addictive use disorder, it is highly common for an individual to also have another mental health or addictive use disorder. Remember, we call that comorbidity. And so what that means is no matter where you're working and no matter what environment and no matter with what population, you're going to more than likely counter addictions. So I've heard students say often, I have no interest in working with addictive use disorders. And my response to that is usually good luck in finding a job as a counselor where you do not encounter addictive disorders in some way, shape, or form. All right, so in this chapter, y'all have three assignments that you're going to do. The first assignment, or one of the assignments rather, is to practice doing an assessment, and the assessment that I chose is the audit. That's included in Canvas. I wrote this in the instructions, but I want to reiterate because it's really important. You're going to practice administering the audit screening tool to a friend or a relative, someone that you're comfortable with, and someone who does not have an addictive use disorder, at least one that you assume or think does not have an addictive use disorder. And your mock client should be informed. You need to tell them that their answers need to not be real. They need to make up answers. So they can make up answers that either reflect a severe substance use disorder or a mild substance use disorder, or even maybe not one at all. Your mock client has the sort of artistic freedom, if you will, to choose what answers they make up. The point of this is not to counsel your friends or to even pretend to counsel your friends. The point of this is to give you experience administering one of these screening tools. So this is purely experiential from your perspective. I cannot reiterate that enough. Please do not do this assessment or screening tool in real life. We are not at that stage yet. So again, this is supposed to be a practice and supposed to be made up answers. The other thing is you're going to do a quiz, and then the other assignment is there's a couple of questions based off of a case study that's in your book about Tanya, and you'll see that, and it's just a couple of little things that I want you to respond to. So let's jump into assessment and diagnosis. Okay, so when we assess and when we use these sort of standardized assessments and screening tools, the point is to compare an individual's behavior and symptoms to the normed or average population. And so we can determine based off of these assessments and screening tools where an individual lies based off of normal behaviors, or an individual who doesn't struggle with a mental health issue or addictive use disorder. It can also sort of norming or comparing their behaviors or symptomatology to normed behaviors can also enlighten an individual to the potential of a problem, so of them having a problem. So they may not even be aware of having a problem, or in denial that they have a problem, and when they are normed, or when they are given one of these assessments that look at normal behaviors and symptomatology, they can see that maybe theirs is either outside of sort of that normed perspective. Of course, clients can deny and minimize a problem. And as I've said many, many, many times, that denial is sort of the underpinning of all addictive use disorders. So denial is going to be present if you work with someone who you think or you speculate or has an addictive use disorder. In some way, shape, or form, denial will show up. And oftentimes that denial shows up when trying to assess or diagnose. A lot of these assessments and screening tools are either self-administered or interviewed type screening tools, and it's not difficult for someone to sort of fudge the truth or minimize their use or minimize their behaviors or actions of their use. Just a real quick note, so your book references the DSM-4. Obviously, we do not use that anymore. That's been replaced with the DSM-5, so that information isn't current. I would encourage you to reference your DSM-5. So those of you that have had DSM already, you have a DSM book. If you have not had DSM course yet, I'm going to strongly encourage you to get your DSM. You're going to need it, and reference the section on substance-related and addictive disorders. I'm going to talk about it a little bit today, but again, that's going to be really brief. So let's see. Moving through these PowerPoints, I'm kind of doing that as we go. So your book talks about the diagnostic interview, and the diagnostic interview is information or questions that you're going to ask and information that you're going to gather that gives you a clear picture or a clearer picture of the individual and the consequences that the individual has as a result of their use. Those consequences are social, emotional, and physical, of course. And so you want to you want to ask these questions to get this picture, if you will, of the individual, and you can assess the severity based off of this diagnostic interview. You also need to assess their stage of change. And so when we talk about stage of change, this should not be new information to anyone. We're talking, of course, about pre-contemplation, contemplation, action, stage, maintenance stage. And so those stages that individuals go through as they progress in making behavioral changes. If you need to reference your stages of change, please go back and do so. That's going to be really important for you as you move forward in any of your classes, really, but also in addictive use disorders, or in this class. So the DSM-5, there's 11 groups. The substances are grouped, into sort of 11 categories. Alcohol, caffeine, cannabis, cocaine, hallucinogens, inhalants, opioids, sedative hypnotics and anxiolytics, stimulants, tobacco, and other or unknown substances. The down and dirty sort of diagnosis, the way I want to put this down and dirty sort of way to diagnose substance disorders is that regardless of the group or the category, they all have very similar criteria. And so the first being that there's a problematic pattern with the substance leading to significant impairment or distress. And so we're talking about taking substances in larger amounts over a longer period of time, a desire to quit, an unsuccessful desire to quit, great deal of time being spent obtaining substances, craving, a failure to fulfill major roles and obligations for work and family because of use, recurrent social and interpersonal problems because of use, impaired social occupational activities because of use, engaging in physically hazardous situations because of use, continued physical problems despite use, and they don't stop using, tolerance, and withdrawal. And of course, not every single one of these criteria have to be met, but the more criteria that are met, the more severe the diagnosis. Again, because this is just a brief synopsis of the chapter, I encourage you to go back to your DSM and take a look. Screening and assessment. Screening indicates where the problem may exist. The assessment, it uncovers some data, and then you want to rule out sort of your hypothesis, and diagnosis, of course, is the standard or prescribed opinion or what you think is going on with the individual. Let's see. The cost of screening and assessments is usually kind of expensive. So agencies that are state or federally funded or grant funded have to have some sort of baseline. So they do screening and assessment. So these cost money, but they are not cheap, of course. And some of these you can administer as a master's level counselor, and some have to be administered by a psychologist. What's important to note is that when you look in the DSM, the way that it sort of defines a substance use disorder is this cluster of symptoms, and this cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms that cause a person significant distress and impairment, and that they just will not stop using. So be mindful of that, and that there's negative consequences. Let me go on. The diagnosis goes from mild to severe, and again, that's based off of how many different criteria they meet in the DSM. I gave you quite a few. I gave you a couple of screening and assessment. I gave you the audit, and I gave you the CAGE. You need to know about the CAGE. The CAGE is just something that it's a set of questions that lead you to think that maybe there's a problem. This is not something that you would base a diagnosis off. I encourage you to open up the CAGE and read it, and you can see how it is not enough information, and you will not get enough information from the CAGE to support a diagnosis. But it's something that you can use to just sort of start the questions to determine if maybe there is a problem. And then, of course, you have the audit. I also included a database that you can look at all the different screening tools and assessments for addictive use disorders. Again, you have the audit. Let's see. What else do I want to? A lot of these assessments are really lengthy, so what's important to know about giving assessments is that if individuals are withdrawing, you may not get cooperation. An individual is not going to want to sit for a 273 question assessment or screening when they're going through withdrawals. And you may not get the most accurate information because of it. So you have to be mindful of that. However, if you are working at an agency and you're receiving funding, then you have to provide these assessments in order to get funding. So your clients may have to sit through questionnaires. These questionnaires oftentimes, or these assessments oftentimes ask very sensitive information. So you also have to be mindful about how you deliver this information and these questions. The questions can oftentimes ask about sexual assault, family history of abuse, family history of addiction,